Poštovani gledalci, dobrodošli u specijalno izdanje emisije Granice Istoka iz Helsinkija. Ja sam Harun Karčić. Za vrijeme hladnog rata ova zemlja je bila neutralna. Čak i nakon raspada Sovjetskog saveza, finsko javno mnijenje ostalo je skeptično prema članstvu u NATO. Danas blizu 80% Finaca želi da se njihova zemlja pridruži Sjevernoatlantskom savezu. Uprkos svim ruskim upozorenjima, zajedno sa Švedskom, Finska je sredinom ove godine službeno aplicirala za članstvo u NATO. Odluka finske vlade posljedica je ruske invazije na Ukrajinu, jer ova zemlja, koja sa Rusijom dijeli granicu od gotovo 1300 km, osjeća opasnost da bi eventualno mogla doživjeti sudbinu Gruzije ili Ukrajine. Finska je uvijek imala razvijenu ekonomsku saradnju sa Rusijom. Iz Rusije uvozi većinu nafte i plina, a izvozi gotove proizvode, mašineriju i tehnologiju. Održavanje dobrih političkih veza sa Kremljom je uvijek bio jedan od ključnih stubova finske vanjske politike. U ovom izdanju emisije analiziramo zašto je Finska donijela odluku da se pridruži NATO savezu, zbog čega je strateški važan poluotok Kola i kako Finska sa 5,5 milijuna stanovnika može mobilizovati 800.000 vojnika. Prije razgovora sa našim gostima pogledajmo uvodni prilog. So Professor Helen, welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel. Thank you so much for taking time to speak to us. Now, since its founding, NATO's key challenge has been ensuring that its members have the military means to fulfill their political commitments to each other. With Finland, this is quite an easy task, as the Nordic country has been not only meeting the threshold criteria for defense, but even going beyond it, exceeding it in a way. Now, could you talk us through your country's national policy for defense?
Well, Finland's national policy, of course, has been influenced by the Cold War period and its experience with the world wars. So there's always been a kind of a uneasy relationship with Russia or Soviet Union. During the Cold War, of course, Finland had to get along with Soviet Union and had extensive trade ties and political ties, but always the sort of strategic threat would be coming from that direction. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, of course, it's become much more clear what Finland's sort of strategic scenario is in the Baltic, in the Arctic, as a neighbor of Russia, a country that was trying to maintain some semblance of neutrality, although not completely neutral. Of course, joining EU, that already makes you non-neutral in a sense. And then now more recently then with the 2014 invasion of Crimea, that of course already woke up a lot of Finnish policymakers to consider that, okay, we need to take the Russian potential military threat seriously. And of course, with the current Ukrainian crisis or Russian invasion of Ukraine, that has completely sort of realigned Finland's security policy, and now, of course, with NATO accession.
Now, Russia has thus far shown interest in occupying former Soviet states. Finland was never a part of the USSR, despite having earlier been part of Tsarist Russia. What makes you think now that Russia still has irredentist aspirations towards Finland's territory?
I'm not sure if Russia really has that, those kinds of direct aspirations as they may have in Central Europe, Southern Europe, in Asia. I think Finland always has had a credible deterrent in terms of military force. So, of course, if Finland had not had a credible defense policy, military investments, relatively big armed forces, etc., I think then we could talk about a more concrete threat. But given what happened with Ukraine, of course, none of that could be discounted. So in that sense, we have a long history, uneasy relationship with Russia. So there's a credible basis to think that if we didn't have a defense, then Russia could potentially either launch some sort of other type of diplomatic trade conflict or try to take certain smaller piece of territory that would strengthen its positions in the Baltic, for example.
Mm-hmm. Now, has Russia historically viewed the Scandinavian Peninsula as a natural barrier to the open ocean, and was the continued neutrality of countries such as Finland and Sweden regarded as a geopolitical requirement for Russia's quote-unquote survival?
I think even during the Cold War era, when Finland and Sweden were quote-unquote neutral, they weren't really that neutral. I mean, we've discovered afterwards that Sweden, for example, had very close ties with the US during the Cold War. And Finland, of course, despite the fact that it had to maintain a very cordial relationship with the Soviet Union, there was still always a very sort of sizable sort of political will, and also would translate into military investments that would sort of keep it not necessarily neutral all the time. I think for Russia, traditionally, the Arctic has always been interesting in terms of potential natural resources, or of course encountering some other European countries' sway or U.S. interest in the Baltic Sea area or the Arctic. So in that sense, I think they've always been considered kind of a gateway. So if they didn't show a credible defense, for example, then during the Cold War, I wouldn't have been surprised if Soviet Union would have tried to, take over Finnish territory for military purposes. So I think Russia has always considered this as a kind of an interesting, not necessarily strategically that important, except because of trade in the Baltic and the Arctic, and now especially with the oil resources in the Arctic.
Now we know that Russia has a major military base in St. Petersburg, where the Baltic Fleet is located. But they also have a major base in the Bay of Murmansk, where their Arctic fleet is located. And there's also a very significant nuclear deterrent in the Kola Peninsula. Do you see this US-Russia rivalry as shifting towards the Arctic in the coming years?
I think it definitely will. Now the only sort of unknown factor is what is Russia going to look like emerging from this conflict? We don't know what the outcome of the conflict will be either. Will Russia be able to achieve any of its goals militarily or otherwise in Ukraine, which looks very doubtful in many ways. And they have had to withdraw military forces from the Finnish border, a lot of sort of strategic assets from the Finnish border. So right now the Russian military threat is probably at its lowest ever. But in those terms, it's hard to see what Russia will want to do in the future. What is it going to be able to do in the future? Of course, they are competing for the Arctic resources, oil resources, other natural minerals, raw minerals, strategic minerals that are found there, and that with climate change exposing a lot of these for easier exploration, they are interested. I just don't know what their capacity is going to be to do much there. I think the real competition in the Arctic will be between the European countries, the US and China.
Now, going back to Finland's defense policy, Finland is one of the few European countries which is able to mobilize a very large number of soldiers in a very short period of time, despite having a professional army of some 24,000 soldiers. Could you talk us through exactly how does this function in Finland?
Of course, in Finland, the military service is mandatory for all males. And it's, of course, for women also, it's a possibility to serve in the military. There's even been discussion of making it mandatory for women as well. But it's been the attendance in the military force, in getting your military service done has been quite high in Finland for a long period of time. So there's always been this will to sort of defend your own country. There's been national identity surrounded that kind of concept of national defense, service to your country, which is not that dissimilar to some other country like Israel and other nations. So that, I think, has led to the fact that we have such a large reserve, well-trained reserve that can be called up and is trained oftentimes, quite often, sometimes several times a year. You might be called back to refresh your skills. That leads to a very large sort of potential military force that could also serve in the, let's say there was a conflict like Ukraine where some parts of Finland were conquered or taken over by Russia. That would still leave a large sort of citizenry ready to defend their country with guerrilla warfare tactics and other such things. And Finns traditionally also have a large number of weapons at their homes. That would again translate to those kinds of things. I think we're seeing similar things happening in Ukraine right now as well.
And finally, what do you think will be the political fallout from Moscow? Should NATO begin installing, military contingents and NATO infrastructure in Finland once this country joins the alliance?
I think, first of all, again, they'll have to respond in some way. Otherwise, it's again a loss of face and sort of status and so forth. But a big if here is, what kind of resources will they have to dedicate to the Finnish borders? Will it make sense to dedicate a lot of resources there? I could see them strengthening their presence in the Arctic, not as much perhaps in the Finnish border in general. Maybe the naval fleet in St. Petersburg, some other bases might be boosted up a little bit. But overall, I don't think Russia will have the capacity to do much except they'll do something figuratively to show force, maybe placing certain types of weapon systems that could potentially strike important targets inside of Finland fairly quickly, which is, of course, again, is something that the Finns would respond, the NATO would respond to that as well. And in some ways, Finland makes a good or easy partner for NATO because we're already compatible with the NATO military technology and also that we have quite a bit of military equipment and force here already. So we don't require a massive presence of US forces, for example, expeditionary forces like we see in the Baltics, which have a different geographic situation altogether. But they require a little bit more immediate help in case there was a conflict with Russia.
Right, Professor Jari, it was a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again for your time.
Thank you.
Blizu 100.000 Finaca ubijeno je 1940. tokom rata protiv Sovjetskog saveza, kada je zemlja izgubila i 10% svoje teritorije. Od Drugog svjetskog rata do danas, Helsinki je na visokoj razini vojne spreme. Nacija od 5,5 milijuna stanovnika ima ratnu vojnu snagu od oko 280.000 vojnika sa 870.000 uvježbanih rezervista. Nije ukinut vojni rok za muškarce kao u mnogim drugim zapadnim državama nakon kraja hladnog rata. So Irosarka, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel, and thank you so much once again for taking time to speak to us. Now, Russia's President Vladimir Putin has once again stated earlier that relations between his country and Finland and Sweden will inevitably become more tense as the two Nordic countries make their way towards NATO accession. At this moment, how would you describe the security situation in Finland, and how tense is the situation between Finland and Russia?
Well, the security situation is very stable in Finland. So when we started this accession process, I think people had some fears whether we're going to enter a kind of grey area, not knowing, whether we're part of the Western alliance yet. But I think the spring has shown that really there's no security deficit, that Finland is calmly and securely entering the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So we don't have any security deficit in Finland at the moment. But obviously we have to think in long term. And currently Russia's emphasis of action is in Ukraine, and situation is stable here. I think people feel really stable as well. But I have to say that people got scared this spring when Russia invaded Ukraine. And I think it was this feeling of security or feeling of insecurity that really initiated this whole process in Finland, that Finnish people demanded the political leadership to take this step to apply for NATO membership.
What is the overall public support for NATO accession?
At the moment, approximately 75 to 80%. That's according to the most latest polls. But prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine on 24th of February this year, only about 1/4 of the Finnish population really supported membership in NATO. So we've seen numbers doubling, even tripling this spring, month after month. I mean, there was the first opinion poll that was taken early March after the Russian invasion, and already back then, over 50% of the Finns said that they would like Finland to join NATO, and even that was already historic. And now we've seen this number increasing over the course of the events during the spring, and the Finnish people feel really strongly that it's time for Finland to take the step to join NATO.
Now, despite these at times tense relations, official cooperation with Russia is important for Finland. Day-to-day issues such as border security, transportation safety, trade and tourism continue and need to continue. Talk us through your day-to-day relations with Russia.
Well, currently, I mean, one could say that obviously the relations have deteriorated, and Finland has a long history with Russia, and it's been a very pragmatic relationship. But as Finland joined the European Union in the mid-1990s, we also fully emerged with the EU's foreign and security policy. So Finland has taken steps over the years already to impose heavy sanctions on Russia, even after the first war in Ukraine. Obviously, there's been still day-to-day relations that also need to be maintained. I mean, we have things like border security, maritime security, also economic ties. But this spring's events really have demonstrated that there will be a limit up to which the Finnish foreign policy will come closer to Russia as well. So there have been very heavy measures taken against Russia already, and Finland stands united with the rest of the Western world in this action.
Right. What do you think will be the political fallout from Moscow should NATO infrastructure and military contingents be deployed here?
Well, obviously, NATO membership is not something that Russia wants to happen in Finland. I mean, that's been outspoken over the years already, even before the first war in Ukraine. But then I think we've seen a slight softening of the rhetoric as well during the spring. I think Russia has realized that Finland's NATO membership will happen. And as our political leadership, our President Sauli Niinistö has said, this is to maximize our own security, and it's not a zero-sum game. It's not away from anyone. But obviously, if Finland will see NATO troops on ground, for instance, I think this is something that will definitely shake in the bilateral relations between Finland and Russia for a while. But as I said, Finland's NATO membership is not to deteriorate the situation in this geographical region in any way. It's just here to guarantee our security.
So Finland is able to mobilize a large number of soldiers in a very short period of time, despite having only about 23,000 professional soldiers, as far as I know. How exactly does this function?
Yes, well, we have general conscription, and it's mandatory for all males over 18 that are Finnish nationals. And basically it means that everyone who joins the army or goes through the general conscription, which is around, I think, currently 75% of the active male population, they are trained, fully trained to become soldiers, depending whether it's on the sea, on the ground, in army, or then in air forces or the National Guard. So yes, this is something that we have, and this has been built over the decades already in Finland. So yes, this is the backbone of our national defense, and obviously it has been developed to function so that we have specialized troops as well. And for instance, we have procured or will procure those fighters from F-35s from the United States.
64 of them
yes,
from the US.
From the US. So it's not only about the capabilities that we have on the ground or in reserve as well, but also about those material capabilities that we have developed over the years.
Now, with the collapse of the USSR in 1991, a downsized Russia lost its perceived security buffer zones with the West. Now, when you look at Russia's invasions of, Georgia, Ukraine, and its various sometimes veiled threat against Moldova, do you have the feeling that President Putin is trying once again to regain those lost security buffer zones with the West?
Well, I think this is why Finland acted as it did. We decided to apply for the membership because we saw a trend. Georgia, Ukraine 2014, and now the second war in Ukraine, and being so brutal, the second war and attack, that the Finns didn't want to become one of those buffer zones anymore. And it was time to act.
A number of countries have already ratified Finland's accession to NATO. How do you make sense of Turkey's demands when it comes to your country joining NATO? And do you see any justification whatsoever in Ankara's requests?
Well, first of all, Finland and Sweden is not a safe haven for terrorists. This is not true. Both countries take terrorism and anti-terrorism very, very seriously. So I think Turkey is trying, by bringing this discourse of terrorism up, not only speak to Finland and Sweden of what is important for Turkey, but also to the other NATO member states. So Turkey is trying to draw the attention from the other NATO member states to their cause, which is important for obviously all the alliance, a fight against terrorism, but especially for Turkey, given the geopolitical proximity to Middle East, for instance. And therefore, I think this spring and this summer, what we saw, and in Madrid in June, in the Madrid summit, that Turkey was really speaking for the other NATO member states as well, not only for Finland and Sweden. But I think also Finland and Sweden have to realize now, when they are joining the alliance, that they will really have to pull in for the collective security of the whole alliance, not only the Nordic security and the Nordic region and the northern flank. Also, it is important to realize that there are security threats in the south, which are maybe not that relevant for Finland and Sweden currently, but are relevant for the other NATO member states.
For NATO's southern flank.
Yeah, NATO's southern flank. And how will they contribute to that defense? That is important to realize. And Finland and Sweden will definitely pull in some way.
Right, Istoka, it was a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again for your time.
Thank you so much.
Ulaskom Švedske i Finske u NATO, Baltičko more će praktično postati unutrašnje jezero NATO-a. Ruska eksklava Kaliningrad, okružena Poljskom i Litvanijom, mogla bi lahko biti odsječena. a to će drastično sasjeći operativnost ruske baltičke flote. U blizini je i poluotok Kola, jedna od najgušćih riznica nuklearnog oružja na svijetu, gdje je također stacionirana i ruska arktička flota u luci Murmansk. Ulaskom Finske u NATO, rivalstvo između SAD-a, Evrope i Rusije poprima sasvim nove dimenzije. Predsjednik Vladimir Putin za sad ima previše posla u Ukrajini da bi se bavio poduzimanjem bilo kakvih koraka prema Finskoj. Ruske trupe koje su bile smještene blizu granice sa Finskom premještene su na jug Ukrajine. Ipak, sa vremenom vjerovatno bi mogao i trupe i projektile ponovo prebaciti u blizinu finske granice i narediti pojačano patroliranje mornarice i zračnih snaga. Poštovani gledalci, bilo je to sve u ovom specijalnom izdanju emisije Granice Istoka iz Helsinkija. Ukoliko ste propustili bilo koji dio, emisiju možete pregledati na našoj web stranici balkans.aljazeera.net.